Good morning to Europe, good afternoon to Asia, and good evening to those all across the fruited plains. You are now locked into the worldwide 20-megabit beacon of truth, hope, and justice, otherwise known as your nightly dose of the Crimson Pill. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Wednesday, August the 31st, 2011 edition of the Crimson Pill radio program. I am your host, Antonin Fiore. And we have another absolute stack of information, articles, and disclosures to bring to your attention this evening, not the least of which is a bit of a continuation, if you will, from last night's program as we talked about some of the horrific medical experimentation that they attempt to use the whitewashed label of research to describe, and yet despicable in its ramifications and in its lack of moral compass. I'm talking about the disclosures made in the last year, and then in particular as a presidential panel on these experiments done in Guatemala in the 1940s was brought to mainstream media attention. But I also told you last night about the Tuskegee experiments. I referenced Project MK-Ultra. I referenced the experimentation done on U.S. troops regarding radiation effects. The list is endless, folks, and all of that experimentation continues even today, in particular with the insidious and hideous work that they're doing pertaining to and surrounding vaccinations. It's absolutely unspeakable, and tonight I'd hope to continue a bit on that thread with a story that some of you may find difficult to believe. What if I told you, for example, that in 1951, a United States citizen, a woman who I will not mention her name quite yet, but she died very unfortunately, tragically, due to cervical cancer. She died in 1951, and yet what if I told you that this woman who died basically, 6 decades ago, is still living today all around the world, that she is, in fact, immortal, if you will. Now, some folks in the listening audience may have had some exposure to this story in the past, but for those of you who have not, I'm talking about the immortal life of Ms. Henrietta Lacks, an African-American United States citizen from the state of Virginia that, again, died in 1951 of cervical cancer. And yet, at this very moment, today, all around the world, there are more of her cells that are alive and well in petri dishes and other research experimentation than were existing in the sum total of her entire body while she was still alive. Please stay tuned through these messages from our sponsors. We'll pick up this story of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks after a brief commercial break. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen of the RBN listening audience, to the Crimson Pill radio program. I am your host, Antonin Fiore, and I am about to begin telling you about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. Now, that phrase is a little sensationalistic, and it is not of my own invention. That's actually the title of a book written by Rebecca Skloot. And, whether or not you pick up the book, of course, is your decision, but through the wonder of the Internet, you could do a couple of quick searches and come up with quite a lot of your own research on the story of Henrietta Lacks. The last name is spelled L-A-C-K-S. A United States citizen, someone just like you and me, trying to make their way through the world, a mother of, I believe was 5 children. She died at a tragically young age of 31, and this was back in 1951, 6 decades ago. And yet, despite the fact of her passing 60 years ago, there are more cells from her body alive today than there were at the time while she was still living. That may sound hard to believe. Let me tell you a bit more about her story. She died of cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. This would have been unremarkable except for one thing. Before she died, researchers took a sample of her cancer cells and successfully grew them in a lab culture, marking the first time that a human cell line had survived outside a human body. Lacks' cells did more than just survive, they thrived. Medical researchers and cell biologists who had struggled for decades to grow human cells for study now found it almost as easy as growing mold on soggy bread. Lax cells and their billions upon billions of descendants, which were dubbed or called HeLa, so H-E and then L-A, and that's even how medical experts and researchers refer to that line of cells even as today, the HeLa cells. Well, these cells, the billions and billions of descendants, were bought, sold, traded, and shared all over the world, to the point where there, as I mentioned before, there's more of her cells alive today than there ever were as she actually walked the earth, living and breathing as one of us. Now, the HeLa line of cells has become a workhorse of research labs, the cellular equivalent of guinea pigs. They've contributed to any number of medical breakthroughs, from the Salk polio vaccine to treatments for AIDS. But here's where it is, I'm not going to say interesting, I'm going to say just plain pathetic, horrifying, despicable, and yet it's exactly what we would come to have expected, not only just from our government, but also from the multinational corporate conglomerations that are doing just as much to take over our lives, to diminish and annihilate our freedoms and liberties as the government itself, because we are, in fact, folks in America living in a fascist state today. I don't say that to be sensationalistic or provocative. It is fact. Many Americans don't even understand the definition of the term fascism, the fact that it is a close marriage, this close interwoven relationship between the private sector and corporations along with that of the government. And because you have been programmed and you've heard these phrases about public-private partnerships, these kind little buzz phrases and whitewashed terminology of that nature, so many of you have been sold on the idea that, oh, the government is merely trying to tap the efficiencies and the expertise that are found in the private sector. Folks, those are generic white bread terms to hide and disguise the fact that it's fascism. That is exactly what fascism is, and I don't want to go down that tangent much farther just now. I'd like to return to the story of Henrietta Lacks. Wouldn't you know that her own family members were not told about any of the breakthrough information regarding her cells and how they were being utilized in research? Not until the 1970s, more than 20 years after her death, when Johns Hopkins researchers sought out her family members and descendants for follow-up testing. You see, the HeLa cells were so robust that they had contaminated and taken over other cell cultures. And so the researchers were looking for what are called genetic markers, hoping that they could find them in her family members and her descendants in order to use to further the research. So not until the 1970s did her husband and children learn about her, well, if you want to call it an afterlife, that's what it would be. The family's response, of course, shock, anger, curiosity, desire for some sort of recognition at the very least, if not, in fact, some sort of compensation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to try to contemplate for a moment, given the extent of all the range of research that these cells have been used and have been conducted in, I'd like you to consider just exactly how many millions of dollars, if not, point in fact, billions of dollars, have traded hands in the forms of profits by these companies that have taken advantage of these cells. You want a little proof? There are nearly 11,000 patents involving the HeLa line of cells. Almost 11,000 patents involving those cells. And yet, she and her family did not receive any recognition and did not receive a single dime for so very long after her passing. And even today, the full story of compensation, if you'd like to refer to it that way, or at least some form of remuneration, is still a pity case. Folks, it's for the same reason, the same rationale as the experiments in Guatemala that I told you about in the last program, the Tuskegee experiments themselves. These people, many of them medical professionals, many of them having supposedly taken the Hippocratic Oath and then just recklessly annihilating that oath with no moral compass whatsoever, with no compunction, with no hesitation to commit these heinous acts on their fellow citizens. Please don't mistake me. It wouldn't make it any better, any nicer if we conducted it on people from other countries like the unfortunate Guatemalans in the 1940s. That makes it no better. Don't mean to make it sound that way. But ladies and gentlemen, these are white-collar professionals who conducted much of their research at not only at the request or at the behest, but at the concerted direction of the United States government in the form of the U.S. Public Health Service. I need to slow down. I need to calm down a little bit. I just absolutely begin to lose my fuse as I start to talk about some of these subjects, the way that they run around recklessly using the very life. It's not even just the intellectual property. It's the biological property of another human being that they make 11,000 patents on, and they don't even think twice about the idea of perhaps looking at remunerating in some form the family that these were taken from, particularly given that, as the family recounts, while she was still in the hospital, there were samples taken. A small part of her cervix was taken off, a healthy part and a cancerous part, without her permission. They've used this line of cells this entire length of time to do things like come up with Salk's treatment for, oh heavens, for the polio vaccine, along with AIDS research, other forms of cancer research, 11,000 patents, all taken without her permission. Ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you to do your own follow-up research regarding the story of the immortal life, if you will, of Henrietta Lacks. Almost, if you will, a bookend or an exclamation point on some of the subject matter that we covered last night with the experimentation done. Folks, I know that for many of you, it seems hard to believe that our government, that our intelligence community, that our law enforcement apparatus can work hand in hand to conduct this sort of experimentation. I mentioned MKUltra briefly the other night. Those of you who are unaware of MKUltra, you need to do your research there as well. Do a search, all capital letters, the letter M, K, and then the word ultra, U-L-T-R-A. This research was conducted from, in essence, not long after the conclusion of World War II, certainly the early 1950s, running until the 1970s. It was in response to some of what they believed was being done to some of our prisoners of war in the form of interrogation, advanced interrogation techniques, perhaps utilizing forms of mind control. And so our own government, your own taxpayer dollars, went to work funding these research programs that were, in essence, orchestrated out of the CIA, conducted again for the course of a couple of decades. And, you know, there's a tremendous amount of information and detail on the subject if you'll do your research, but let me just at least tease you with this carrot about the extent to which their lack of moral compass, their outright immorality, led them. Again, your CIA, working in conjunction with university researchers, psychologists, medical professionals, as well as working in conjunction with the FBI and local law enforcement,